On May 2nd, 2024, the Karen Reed murder trial continued with 3 witnesses called by the prosecution. These were all paramedics from the Canton Fire Department, and all of them testified to arriving at the scene on January 29th, 2022 to provide emergency care for John O'Keefe. All of them also testified to varying degrees of nuance about statements that they said that they heard Karen Reed made. And it was another impressive day by the defense. Let's get into it. Okay, so if you've been following along, you know that at the end of day 2 of this trial, the prosecution had begun but not yet finished the direct examination of Anthony Flematti. As a reminder, Flematti was one of the paramedics in the Canton Fire Department who responded to the 911 call. And in fact, he was the lead paramedic on scene. So on day 2, there wasn't really all that much that he had testified to that was quite honestly of interest. But on day 3, he testified on direct examination about John O'Keefe's injuries, the various treatments that they gave him, and a conversation he had with Karen Reed, where Flematti said he was specifically trying to elicit information from her about what had happened for the purposes of aiding treatment. As for the injuries, he had a low body temperature that put him in the extreme hypothermia category. He also had cuts on his right arm, he had a couple black eyes, and a distended belly that didn't appear to have any external signs of trauma, and his pupils were apparently 4 millimeters and non-reactive. He also testified that he had blood in several places on his body, but that all of it had dried. And as for his clothing, unlike day 2's Timothy Nuttall, Mr. Flematti testified that John O'Keefe was not appropriately dressed for the weather. What he recalled of his clothing was that he was wearing a light sweatshirt, jeans, and that he was missing a shoe. That missing shoe keeps coming up, and it's only deepening my personal need for an explanation as to what happened to it and how it went missing. If in fact it flew off because Karen Reed rear-ended him, I can understand that. But if so, it would have arguably landed nearby. So how was it not recovered when the police were gathering evidence? That's really the main question that I have about this shoe. Anyway, the most important part of his testimony probably was a conversation that he says that he had with Karen Reed. He said that he decided to talk to her because she seemed to be the most personally affected and the most distressed, and so therefore he figured that she probably had the most information about his background. And he said that he was specifically trying to get as much information from Karen Reed as possible regarding John O'Keefe's background and what happened to him in order to aid in the treatment. So he asked her who the person on the ground was and how they got there. And he said, the only response that I personally got was, I hit him. So in this moment, we have someone who has correctly identified John O'Keefe's clothing according to photos of clothes that were referenced in court in day 2. So he's doing better than Timothy Nuttall in terms of his memory, so far anyway. So now in this moment, this does in fact look pretty damaging for Karen Reed. But of course, by now we've learned not to count out the defense team's cross-examination. Because again, cross-examination is where the rubber hits the road. A witness generally looks really good and credible on the witness stand in the friendly environment of a direct examination. But it's the pressure of cross-examination that will determine how well that testimony holds up for the jury. So then, what happened on cross-examination as to the point regarding Karen Reed's statements? Well, Alan Jackson had yet another great cross-examination. Honestly, he really is such a joy to watch during this trial. And there were a few points that he did get from Flematti on the stand that called into question the accuracy of Flematti's testimony about Karen Reed's alleged admission. For one thing, he pointed out that Flematti never included that statement in his report on the incident. Jackson also pressed Flematti about what he did following Karen's supposed admission about hitting John. Specifically, he asked if Flematti followed up that statement with more questions, namely how she hit John. Because if you do think about it, someone who's just arriving onto a scene might hear about someone hitting someone else and think, there are multiple possibilities. Maybe she hit him with her fist and knocked him down to where he hit his head or something. Or maybe she hit him with her car. There are a number of possibilities here. But when Flematti said that he didn't follow it up with more questions, but instead transferred her over to another paramedic, Katie McLaughlin, it would seem that he was left with an ambiguity as to the meaning of I hit him. Now, maybe you look at that and say, look, what we commonly understand to mean I hit him is is I ran over him with my car. And I totally understand that. It's entirely a possibility that he thought of it in that way too. But the defense has made a good point that if Flematti was asking Karen these questions for the purposes of patient care, you would think that he would want to be specific about the answers that he got. Anyway, another thing that Jackson did on his cross-examination was to go through the dash cam footage showing the paramedics on scene. And while showing it, he would stop at every point where there was a paramedic that looked like they were nearby Karen. At each point, Flematti testified that he couldn't recognize who the paramedic was. And this is likely partly because they were all wearing the same yellow jacket, and because the dash cam was a bit obfuscated with active snowfall. However, it is interesting that the video didn't in any way trigger his own memories to say something like, "That's me, that's when I was talking to the defendant." Because by the end, there was no confirmation through this dash cam corroboration that he even had an opportunity to stop and talk with Karen while rendering aid to John. And in fact, there was a moment at the end of the dash cam video footage being played where Flematti basically said, "I didn't see my conversation with her on the video." Now, here's another big issue for Flematti's recounting of the alleged admission by Karen Reed. Towards the end of the cross-examination, Jackson noted that when the paramedics transferred John O'Keefe over to the hospital staff, there were notes taken about his injuries, his treatments, and all of that kind of stuff that would have helped with his treatment. But one thing that is missing from the hospital's notes is any mention whatsoever about Karen saying, "I hit him," or even the possibility that his injuries may have been a result of being hit by a vehicle or being hit by something else based on what Flematti was told at the scene of the incident. And mind you, this is on top of the fact that the "I hit him" statement isn't recorded in any of the other contemporaneous documentation by the paramedics or actually by the police, it seems. And when pressed on all of this, Flematti told Jackson that he remembered relaying that to the doctors and the nurses nonetheless. But what followed was some intense heat from the defense on that point.
You testified at the grand jury that you wanted, once you got to the hospital, you wanted to be as quote unquote helpful as possible when you handed over the patient, correct?
Correct.
You said you actually stayed at Good Samaritan for an additional 10 to 20 minutes, which is your habit in cases like this, because you wanted to be quote unquote an asset to the medical intervention team, correct?
Correct.
That team includes the doctors and nurses that were trying to provide life-saving services to Mr. O'Keefe.
Correct.
But you never relayed to a single doctor or a single nurse a single word about a woman who said, "I hit him," did you?
So documentation for us ends at transfer of patient care. As far as my memory, I do remember relaying that information to the doctors and nurses.
You do?
Yes.
Have you ever testified about that ever previous to this?
Never been asked about that.
Oh, nobody ever asked you, so you didn't tell anybody?
In the court setting, no.
Testified in front of a grand jury, didn't you?
Yes.
Mr. Lally asked you a bunch of questions.
Yes.
During the course of that conversation that was under oath, did you ever disclose that you told the doctors and the nurses that you heard a woman say, "I hit him"?
I recall telling the doctors and nurses that there's a question of that the patient was hit by a vehicle or we don't know, is what I directly said to the doctors and nurses.
You directly told the doctors and nurses that there was a question about whether or not he was hit by a vehicle, right?
Yes.
Have you ever said that in any context, either to the police or in a grand jury before today?
I don't recall.
You were asked a bunch of questions yesterday, the day before yesterday, and this morning by Mr. Lally.
Yes.
Did you say it on your direct examination?
I wasn't asked that question.
So since Mr. Lally didn't ask you, you just left it out, that you told the doctors, the medical professionals, that in fact you described that this patient was likely hit by a car.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
You wrote a report as well, correct?
Yes.
We talked a little bit about that report. There's an area in the report for a narrative.
Yes.
about your observations, your experiences with this patient, correct?
Correct.
Your job as a lead paramedic is to be as detailed as possible, correct?
Correct.
You want to provide and impart the most detail you possibly can about an incident to assist in medical intervention, correct?
Correct.
Take a look at page 3 of 5 of your report.
Yes,
You see that narrative area?
I do.
Can you point to that portion of your report where you indicate that my client said the words, "I hit him"?
It doesn't say that.
Can you point to your report, the portion of your report, where you indicate that you told the doctors and nurses that she said, "I hit him"?
It doesn't say that.
Can you point to that portion of your report where you indicate that your concern for the patient was that he had been hit by a car?
It doesn't say that.
You indicated on direct examination that you were, quote unquote, looking for anything that we could pass on to the emergency room that would assist.
Yes.
I think it might have been an assistance to the emergency room personnel to indicate that you believe this person had been hit by a car.
Objection.
Sustained.
Do you believe that that would have been an important piece of information to pass on to the emergency room assistants?
Objection.
I'll let him have that.
Right. It would have been important, yes.
And it's nowhere in your reports, correct?
It's not in the reports, no.
You didn't tell that to the police when you were interviewed 8 days later.
I was not asked about how or what I was.
My question is,
Yes.
did you tell the police 8 days later, or 9 days later when you were interviewed? And you didn't tell the grand jury that, correct?
No,
And you didn't mention that on direct examination in front of these jurors, did you?
no.
So by the end, there definitely are some serious questions raised as to whether or not Karen actually said, "I hit him, I hit him." The fact that it doesn't show up in any of the medical documentation when it would be highly relevant for them for purposes of patient care is, I think, important. But will the jury be convinced? I really don't know. Let me know what you think. Anyway, the state's 7th witness was Matthew Kelly, another paramedic with the Canton Fire Department. He also testified that John O'Keefe was not appropriately dressed for the weather, and he testified similarly to Mr. Flematti as to John's injuries. But the thing that's very different about his testimony is that he testified to only hearing Karen Reed say one thing, and that was, "He's dead. He's effing dead." Of course, at trial, Mr. Carey used the actual F word because that is actually what he heard. I'm just self-censoring for the purposes of YouTube so that they don't punish me for it. Anyway, on cross-examination, David Yannetti also extracted from Mr. Kelly that he never heard Karen say, "I hit him, I hit him." And now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that the statement wasn't said and it wasn't heard by someone else. Another thing that Yannetti drew out of Mr. Kelly was that one of the top priorities during this incident was to warm up John's body. And this meant getting him to the ambulance as soon as possible, removing his clothes, and using body warming techniques. It also meant keeping the interior of the ambulance warm, which meant closing the ambulance door while they worked. And this is a very interesting point because obviously that isolates the paramedics from everyone else while they do this work. And it minimizes the possibility that the paramedics were able to speak with anyone else while working. And this can cut both ways, obviously. On the one hand, they may have not heard damaging statements that were actually being made by the defendant, which were heard by others outside of the ambulance. But on the other hand, paramedics inside the ambulance could have thought they heard something that wasn't actually stated because they were somehow convinced that they had heard it. But anyway, overall, this bit of nuance from Mr. Kelly is helpful to the defense because it suggests an inconsistency between what these various paramedics heard. And with that, let's turn to the state's 8th witness. This was Francis Walsh, a lieutenant paramedic with the Canton Fire Department. And the most important thing that he testified to, like the others, was what he observed of Karen Reed. He said that she looked very distressed. He said that she was screaming and crying and that she and another woman were frantically moving around. And when asked about any statements Karen Reed may have said, he said,
"All I recall her saying was, is he alive?"
So this is yet another witness similar to Matthew Kelly in that he has yet another statement that he says that he heard Karen say. Now, does this mean that she did or didn't say any or all of these statements? That is definitely up to interpretation. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. On cross-examination, the defense basically just emphasized that that was all that Lieutenant Walsh heard Karen Reed say, or that he said that he heard her say. So this was actually a really quick witness testimony from top to bottom. Okay, so then we turn to the final witness of the day, Kate McLaughlin. She is yet another paramedic with the Canton Fire Department. And she is another witness who testified to hearing Karen Reed say, "I hit him, I hit him." Specifically, here's what Miss McLaughlin said.
So at that point, I asked her if there had been any significant trauma that happened before this.
What, if anything, did she say?
So she said, "I hit him." She repeated it. There was a woman standing across from her who I believe at that point said, "You're hysterical. You need to calm down. You're hysterical." She repeated, "I hit him." And there was a police officer who was in that vicinity kind of with us who replied, "You what?" She repeated it one more time. And that officer then signaled to somebody, "Get Goody down here," which I'm assuming would be the sergeant.
And with respect to when Ms. Reed said this repeatedly, "I hit him," can you describe for the jury sort of the tonality of that? Like, how did she say it? She was very, very upset. She seemed hysterical, I would even say. Just very upset. But once you received that information, did you follow up with any other questions to Ms. Reed at that point?
At that point, I did not. I have to drive the ambulance, so it's a time-sensitive situation, so I knew I had to drive the ambulance. It was said in the presence of the police officer, so I felt like that was the appropriate, that information was appropriately transferred, and I just felt, based on her demeanor, I don't think it would have been productive for me to continue to ask her questions at that point.
So again, this is another person who says Karen Reed said, "I hit him, I hit him." And here, it's notable that Miss McLaughlin says that another police officer took notice of the alleged admission. However, again, based on what we've heard so far, it didn't make it into any of the contemporaneous reports that were put together by the police or by the medical personnel. And that is weird, especially if a police officer apparently took special notice of the statement. But by the end of day 3, prosecutor Adam Lally was not able to finish Miss McLaughlin's direct examination. So day 4 is actually going to pick up Friday morning, even though normally it's not a court day per the original scheduling. But Judge Canone said that she wants Miss McLaughlin to finish her testimony on day 4, and after that the jury is actually going to go on a special site visit afterwards. I didn't catch her say exactly where this will be, but I presume it's going to be on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road. The media is surely not going to be allowed at this site visit, so we won't be viewing it. But we are back in court Friday morning to wrap up Miss McLaughlin's testimony. So with that, what do you think so far? Are you leaning towards guilt, non-guilt, or neither so far because you need more information? What do you make of this testimony so far about Karen Reed's alleged statements at the scene of the incident? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more coverage of the Karen Reed trial, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video or live stream is available. See you in the next one.